Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our educational series presentation. My name is Davide Helmo, and I'm a professor of rock engineering at the University of British Columbia. In this presentation, this video, we will discuss a very important topic. You can see here from the title, which is the issue of using new technologies without paying attention to the meaning of the terms we use in our engineering research and profession. First of all, I also would like to thank my co-author, Beverly Young, for their input and comments. And as I said, as you see from the title, this is not a standard technical presentation. We have opted for a different format that involves telling a story and intercalating technical slides in between. The title, The Alchemist and the Rock Tower of Babel, suggests this is going to be a creative and thought-provoking story about the misuse of terms and how they are used to drive discussion and support the results of our analysis. We also discuss the issue of using new technologies without taking into account important limitation of data quality and data quantity. And hopefully you're going to find this presentation useful and interesting. So let's start with our story. And what we're going to do, as I said, we're going to have slides with the story intercalated with more technical discussions. The Alchemist and the Rock Tower of Babel. How would you want to describe the Alchemist lab? The legend says that the Alchemist lab looked like a tower, and its shape changed as the alchemists walk its long stairs and passageways. To those working the tower, the passage of time felt distorted. It was not uncommon for the terminology and industry practices employed by the alchemists to continuously stretch from the past into the future. The following description tells us our story of the time we visited the tower. We met our guides, a group of brave alchemists, as they stood questioning the tower's shape from a distance. They warned us to abandon what we thought we knew or imagined about the tower and what it contained. As we got close, we could appreciate how vast the tower base was. Arches and buttresses adorned its outer walls, with a spiral ramp running between the flat terraces that grew progressively smaller. Over the years, the alchemists had erected many arches and buttresses. Their shape reflected shifting empirical conditions and opinions. Some carried relatively obscure names, which appeared to conceal a philosophical secret. Some later complete. Blame the validation oracles, the brave alchemists said, as they decide what a good arch or a valid buttress are. We could not help but notice the new arches built in honor of the idols of the machine learning. The foundation rested somehow precariously on the top of the arches of the idols of the cave. Are the validation oracles equipped to check the stability of the tower? We asked. However, our question remained unanswered. One of the alchemists pointed to one of the arches at the base of the tower. Its appearance was unassuming as that meant that of many of the adjacent arches. Description above the arch, idols of the tribe, remind us that our mind filters observation, therefore observation is subjective and open to biases. The arched passageway led to a wooden door, which revealed a second inner arch and a second inscription, idols of the marketplace. The name of the second arch was a striking warning about the use of language and to communicate ideas in a way that better fits one's arguments. Many who have learned the art of rock engineering have forgotten this description and the messages they carry, whispered the brave alchemists. The entrance of the tower was now in our view. Doors open at regular intervals along the inner walls of the spiral staircase, leading to many chambers, every one of them named after a term the alchemists use in their work. So let's pause the story for now and let's start our technical discussion and explain why the alchemists refer to when speaking about the idols of the cave and the idols of the marketplace. In the late 1500s, Francis Bacon proposed the concept of idols of the mind. Philosophy may seem to be far away from rock engineering or engineering as a whole, but Bacon's concept is a powerful reminder of how subjectivity manifests in engineering knowledge. For example, we have the idols of the tribe. That means that our observations are filtered through our minds, and therefore they are subjective and open to biases. For example, we know that core-logging methods are subjective and influenced by personal experience, and are even influenced by having different different guidelines used by different companies. We have the idols of the cave. Arguments we know are created to fit our experience and data are selectively sought. We can think of many examples, including the justification of methods. They have numerous limitations, and for which validation is based on selective use of data or personal preference. And saying, for example, we have used it for years and therefore it works, is not a scientific validation. We have the idols of the marketplace. We know that the use of language can be used to communicate ideas in such a way that better fits our arguments. We will encounter this issue later in the story when discussing the abuse of such terms as accuracy, precision, calibration, validation, etc. We had another story published on our YouTube channel about the GSI quantification method, and we have argued against the wrong use, for example, the terms quantity or the terminology of to quantify. And finally, we have the idols of the theater. This means that refers to the uncritical acceptance of methods and popular theories. Where to start here when we talk about engineering, rock engineering in particular? As I said in an earlier story, we have already met what we call the validation oracles and the defense of empirical methods, while at the same time not accepting new methods that could improve on their limitations. And let's continue actually our philosophical journey through the interpretation knowledge when it comes to engineering. Let's look at the more provocative argument. You may not be familiar with the allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave is an allegory used by the Greek philosopher Plato, and it was contained in his work, The Republic. The allegory was used to explain the process of gaining knowledge. In this allegory, Plato describes a group of people who have lived in a cave all their lives. They are chained so they can only look at the wall in front of them. Behind the people, there is a fire, and between the fire and the people, there is a raised walkway where puppeteers hold up basically puppets that can cast shadows on the wall in front of the people in the cave. The people in the cave, therefore, are unable to see the puppeteers or the puppets, and they believe that the shadows on the walls are the only reality that can exist. One day, one of the people in the cave is freed from the cave and is able to see the puppeteers and the puppets. The person is initially confused and overwhelmed by the new sights and sounds, but as this person adjusts to the new environment, they begin to understand the true nature of reality. And they realize that the shadows on the walls were just an imitation of the real objects, being manipulated by the puppeteers. Upon returning to the cave, the person tries to explain to the others what they've seen and learn, but the others are unable to understand and dismiss the person claims as nonsense. The person is then able to see the cave in the new light and is able to appreciate the limitation of the other's understanding. In our interpretation, the shadows on the cave walls represent the process of quantification qualitative assessment. They're very common and commonly accepted in some data collection processes. The chains holding the engineers in the caves are the qualitative and semi-quantitative methods used and often justifies industry standards, despite having many limitations. The chains therefore represents the cognitive biases, the human factor that are ever present in our design interpretation. Let's go back to a story now and continue basically the journey to the rock tower of Babel. The Acro's chamber was the first one that we encountered as we made our way to the spiral staircase. We could not understand why the alchemist had built his entrance so close to the precision chamber. Indeed, the arrangement may confuse people, said one voice in our party, and the brave alchemist silently nodded. As we stepped inside the chamber, we noticed that things appeared not as accurate as one would expect. We could appreciate the position and values of many objects carefully aligned on the bookshelves, but there were also many vacant spots identified only by handwritten labels. We read some of these labels aloud. ISRM hardness field identification, joint condition ratings. Those are qualitative assessments, the brave alchemist quickly pointed out. They do not belong here, for those are not measurements and therefore cannot be called accurate. The precision chambers, on the contrary, was everything we expected. The alchemist could sometimes measure values very precisely. Thus, the many objects are arranged like darts concentrated around the intended target. At times, the random error was too large and the objects were scattered in different positions. Look over there, the brave alchemist pointed to a corner of the chamber. Those are rock mass classification ratings. alchemists can claim to estimate precise assessments of rock mass quality. However, no matter how close these assessment rock mass quality are to each other, no alchemist can claim the estimate to be accurate. Accuracy belongs to measurements. So let's look at this now, this problem of accuracy versus precision in a more technical manner. So accuracy and precision are two related but distinct concepts that are often used to describe the quality of measurements or results. And notice that we talk about measurements, not qualitative assessments here. Accuracy refers to how close a measurement or result is to the accepted value. For example, if a measurement is said to be accurate, it means that it's close to the true value of the quantity being measured. Note that the term accepted does not exclude subjectivity, and therefore cognitive bias may still be present even if when we have measurements and we talk about accuracy. Precision, on the other hand, refers to how repeatable or consistent a measurement or result is. If a measurement is said to be precise, it means that multiple measurements of the same quantity will give you very similar results. But what happens when dealing with parameters that cannot be quantified and therefore cannot be measured? Is it possible to speak of accurate, for example, geological strength index, rock mass rating, or Q values? All of these are classification systems used for design purposes in rock engineering. In our story, the brave alchemist says that we determine precise assessment of rock mass quality. However, no matter how close to the assessment rock mass quality are to each other, no alchemist can claim the estimate to be accurate. So let's actually look at an example why we cannot have accurate measurement, inverted commas, of some of the parameters we use in engineering design, and particularly in rock engineering design. And all of this is going to have an implication when you think about using machine learning, and potentially in the future, maybe even the concept of digital twins, when we actually deal with qualities and not quantities. So in this example, we asked 16 different persons with professional experience ranging from 1 to 2 years to more than 10 years to estimate the GSI of a rock exposure. So what is the rock mass quality of this rock exposure? This GSI parameter eventually becomes an input for defining a failure envelope. And therefore, it's a very important parameter when it comes to define the stability of a structure. The person was shown 3 different images, A, B, and C. You can see here, basically from the larger image. Unknown to this person, A, B, and C are part of the same rock exposure, you can see here. And note also that the different scale of A, which is 10 by 10 meter, compared to B and C, which are 5 by 5 meters. The person were also prompted to focus on the structural character of the rock exposure and to assume that the jointing conditions, so what is the quality of these kind of lines you see here in the image, were good. So in a way, we are kind of elicited an answer to focus on the structural character of the rock mass. And when you look at the results for outcrop A, the estimated GSI was 70 plus or minus 10. You can see from the table what is the GSI. It's a system that goes from 0 to 100 in terms of 0 very poor quality to 10 very good quality, basically inter-rock. For outcrop B, the estimated GSI was approximately 63 plus or minus 12. For outcrop C, the estimated GSI was 60 plus or minus 15. So you can already immediately see that the level of precision decreases from A to C. So we increase the scale, the level of precision decreases. So the range becomes larger from plus or minus 10 to plus or minus 15. But remember, we could look at the median or mode of these results. Technically, you shouldn't look at the average or standard deviation of a qualitative assessment because it's not a quantitative measurement. So you shouldn't really do statistical analysis with this type of parameters. But also what we can see, there's actually 2 important results here. First of all, rock mass classification systems are scale dependent. So you have a rating that depends on the scale you're observing. So imagine now translating this one in terms of coding a machine learning algorithm. And also there is no such thing as an accurate GSI because we don't know what is GSI. There's no tool to measure GSI. It's not a quantity. It's not a physical property you can measure. It's a quality. So we can be precise and have a range of values that concentrate around the most typical value, but we don't know whether actually the value is accurate or not, because, as I said, we don't have a way to measure GSI. We cannot tell which of the responses then is close to the right answer because there's no right answer. How do you measure, in this case, GSI, qualitative data? In this specific case, machine learning application with the sole purpose to estimate GSI cannot overcome this limitation. Even if you code it, you can do the best machine learning analysis you want. At the end of the day, you don't know whether your GSI is accurate or not. The only thing you can give is a range, plus or minus 10, plus or minus 15. So there cannot be quantification without measurements. And therefore, can the quantification of qualitative assessment really make it less subjective and less dependent on experience? I mean, we've been working, try to make a joke here with this cartoon, but we've been dealing with this qualitative assessment all the times, but because they look like numbers, so they are numbers, but numbers that's assigned to a quality, we confuse them for quantitative measurements. And then we think we can actually be correct and accurate. And machine learning cannot remove these biases resulting from human interpretation, because particularly when the bias is systemic in the data collection process. Here is not a question of removing outliers, it's a question of the fact that the system we use to collect the data is biased. And therefore, the data you provide to machine learning is biased, and the machine cannot remove that bias. And also, we need to recognize the role of variability. Not all the parameters we use in our design are unique measurements. So there is variability. We saw here plus or minus 10, plus or minus 15. And this is a clear implication when consider our design approach. Indeed, we cannot really tell basically what is the probability of failure of a tunnel slope if it's designed with a factor of safety of X. For example, here, look at this question here. What is the probability of failure of a tunnel or slope designed with a factor of safety of 1.3? We can't say it's 0. And therefore, we need to be very careful not to think that the quantification process and the machine learning algorithm that goes with it, we need to be careful it doesn't lead to a deterministic belief that everything within rock engine design is deterministic. Technically, it's not. So there's always statistical variability that we need to consider. And we need to really understand the differences between how we use this when it comes to define the factor of safety or the probability of failure of a structure. And let's continue actually on this topic. And what we have to realize is that our approach to design should not be driven by what we know, but should actually be driven by what we do not know. And let's actually look at this case, and to support this argument, let's have a look at this statement here. This statement comes from a paper for 2020. You can see the reference number 1, and it's International Engineering Journal. So in this statement, the authors from this paper says the strength factor or factor of safety they were doing a finite element analysis was selected rather than the failure probability, since there was not enough rock mass property data available at the time to the study for a consistent statistical approach. The problem is that this statement suggests that the stability design analysis performed using factor safety approach require fewer data than using probability of failure approach. Is this assumption, this belief, true? And if it's true, what actually are the implications? We assume that the calculated factor safety still require engineers to have sufficient data to determine the range of conditions to be encountered. So we still need data to calculate the factor safety. And yet, according to the statement, this data may not be sufficient to establish an accurate statistical distribution. What it means that under this condition, the calculated factor of safety becomes a factor that masks the lack of data, because if B here, it's the amount of data that we need for statistical analysis, according to the statement, we are actually here in A. We have less data, so we cannot perform a statistical analysis. So this factor of safety masks the fact that we lack in data. So what we call factor of safety is no longer a measurement of engineering certainty. It becomes a measurement of uncertainty, what we do not know. And the larger the uncertainty, or the known unknown uncertainty, because there are two types of uncertainty, the larger the factor of safety required in our design. Maybe we could actually rewrite this statement above and read, there is uncertainty in our analysis, and our design calculation may be wrong because we do not have sufficient data, but we have used a large enough factor of safety, so hopefully we will not be wrong. So how can machine learning algorithms created based on what we know, the training data, capture what we do not know? The answer again is not to use machine learning as a form of oracles, and to remember the important role of variability. We don't know everything, and therefore there's always going to be uncertainty. So what is actually then the value of the prediction from the machine learning algorithm? Especially if there's something you didn't know and therefore it's not being coded in the algorithm. So let's go back now to our story and our journey to the Rock Tower of Babel. Next, we visit the calibration validation chamber. There were stacks upon stacks of models rested inside this chamber. Models of any type, of any shape, with the alchemists compare against natural systems. If necessary, the models were revisited and eventually accepted. Does acceptance imply validation? We asked. Well, it depends on how we define acceptance, the brave alchemist replied. Models are created that reproduce observations, but if they do not reproduce behavior, what we call mechanism, then the models are said to be calibrated but not validated. What about problems for which mechanisms are unknown and can only be verified upon failure? The brave alchemists were quick to answer. That is the nature of our job. The absence of prototypes limits us. We worry about the practice of celebrating the calibration models that predicted the failure of past events. Ultimately, the past is already known to us, and the outcomes of a backward analysis cannot change what has already happened. How can we be so confident that the future events will resemble what we have modeled in the past? Aren't we excluding behavior that falls outside our experience by doing so? The brave alchemists seem to agree with our concern. They knew too well the problem of assigning calibration validation labels to forward models. To calibrate and validate the forward models, we would need data that only exists in the future, they added. We can only do a delayed calibration in the present using continuous monitoring data, but it does not ensure that we can prevent the failure of the structure we have assigned. Ultimately, we all agree that validation of rock mass behavior will always remain challenges as we design structures based on induction principles. Before leaving the calibration validation chamber, the alchemist told us the story of two models built to simulate the same natural system. Both were said to be calibrated, and yet the calibration required using different set of properties. Is this even possible? We asked. Yes, it is possible, they replied, and it is a demonstration that the parameters and processes we use in our models are not actual, since the two models do not truly represent the natural system, but somewhat simplify reality. They concluded the story by making a critical comment. In our work, we compare the results of simplified models to a reality that we know is much more complex. Compromises must be made, and anyone who believes the model to be real surely must have forgotten Borges' words on the exactitude of science. The model serves an engineering purpose, but we should not claim so-called calibrated properties to forcibly apply to new models representing different natural systems. So, what are calibration and validation? We know that calibration refers to the process of adjusting a model to match the values of the data it is attempted to predict. Therefore, calibration would not be possible without data. And because calibration requires data, we can conclude that calibration represents a form of backwards modeling. Since data exist in the present and the past, they don't exist in the future. In rock engineering practice, for example, backwards modeling seeks to find the values of the parameters that we create eventually, something already known to us in the present. Because something's already happened, unknown conditions should, in principle, be reduced. The problem, unfortunately, begins when we try to use specific data to predict future events. This, for example, imagine like a machine learning algorithm trained upon data from site A, but then used to predict what happens at site B. So, is that possible? Indeed, the calibration numerical parameters from site A does not guarantee the model will be able to predict future conditions at site B. To do so, we must infer rock engineering principle to be universal. How can we be so confident that future events will resemble what we have modeled in the past? Aren't we excluding behavior that falls outside our experience by doing so? That is the problem of an inductive approach to design. What it does is it imposes a non-demonstrated condition of universality to empirical methods, but they are based on experience, so we shouldn't believe they are actually universal. So this idea of a unified theory or unified models, it doesn't really stand up. As mentioned in our story, it is not uncommon for engineers and practitioners to use a different set of properties to calibrate models depending on the different modeling approach they're using. For example, they may use finite element, discrete element, hybrid models, and if you look carefully at the properties they use, they all look differently. So based on this, what is the concept of rock mass strength universal, or is it relative to the modeling approach we use in analysis? And we can actually go even push a little bit more beyond this and even kind of argue, is rock mass strength real? If the properties that we use are not the same and depends on the model that we actually want to use to calibrate or back analyze what happened in the past. And most importantly, we should not forget about the cognitive biases that are always present and impact what we do. Because the way we collect the data, the way we run the analysis, there's always interpretation, and human interpretation is subjective to biases. So let's look at this quote here from Taleb from 2010, from his book, The Black Swan. And this quote reveals the problem with validation numerical models for rock engineering design. I would actually say for engineering in general when we're dealing with natural materials. How can we know the future given knowledge of the past, or more generally, how can we figure out the properties of the infinite unknown based on the finite knowns? The problem with empirical knowledge is indeed that we're dealing with an inductive approach to design, and what we learn from the past may be irrelevant, or even worse, may be misleading. So this idea that we just transpose everything from the past into the future neglects the fact that potentially those conditions are not to be encountered again, or the fact that there is no universal law that basically links what happens at different sites under different conditions. And let's have a look at an example now. Let's consider this set of deformation data for a rock slope over a period of 5 days. What can we conclude from this observation movement over time? Yes, there is movement, there is deformation, but is the slope stable or unstable? What does it mean, for example, in this condition to say that the factor of safety of the slope is greater than 1? And I'm pretty sure the design here would probably have said that factor of safety is greater than 1. But the slope is clearly experiencing deformation. And I already start to now see the issue actually with the entire concept actually of factor of safety, because in a way it cannot consider actual deformations. And what we're going to see here is that the deformation eventually potentially can lead to failure. So it was a stable slope, but it failed. So it tells you something about actually maybe the fact that we don't consider variable time in our design. So, but most importantly, when you look at the data, and for example, don't look at the data from day 6 now, if you look at the trend, well, we know this deformation, but how do you basically translate this trend in a prediction of failure? We may have used, for example, inverse velocity method, and that could have helped us to set up an early warning system to alert of possible unstable conditions. But that method does not predict the future. What it does is just fast forward the present, because to use it, we need to reduce the time series to improve our prediction. So it may give us like a few weeks kind of warning, maybe a few days, but not years. And most importantly, what it does is that we claim to predict failure, but we're not actually using the information to stop the failure, to prevent the failure. So we celebrate in a way the having failure, and a way to say, yes, we knew it was going to happen, but we didn't do anything to stop it. And we could explain this problem using an analogy. Imagine boarding a plane. 2 hours into the flight, the pilots inform the passenger the instrumentation is predicting the plane will fail within the next 3 hours. But instead of immediately landing the plane and finding a solution that could allow the flight to continue safely, the pilots decide to continue the flight. When it becomes clear the plane is about to fail, The pilot orders the passenger to parachute out of the plane. Yes, all the passengers and the pilots land safely, but they can do nothing but to witness the plane crash nearby. That's actually basically what happened here day 6. We knew there were problems, but we didn't do anything to stop the problem from occurring in the first place. Everything was out of the pit safely, but the failure still occurred. We knew, let's go back to the story here. We knew we did not have much time left, so we had to select which chamber to visit next carefully. We all agreed to a visit to the machine learning chamber. It was one of the tower's newer addition, and its construction still needed to be completed. Our minds wondered whether machines could be capable of learning new rock engineering. The alchemists seemed to have anticipated our question and replied, we should first define actually the meaning of learning. Discussion quickly took a philosophical turn, since we could not separate the concept of learning from the idea of knowledge. Language is not neutral, and we should be cautious about using words that live in our minds and the minds of others at perception and certainty. The brave alchemists explained that machine learning used trained data set to recognize patterns to make prediction of inferred behavior. However, the process does not eradicate human intervention. And therefore, we question how machine learning algorithms could objectively learn from data, consider the output would inevitably depend on human factors embedded in the training data. We could see a sign on the ground warning the alchemists not to use machine learning to predict, for example, Rothmar classification ratings. And we wonder whether the intention was that eventually for the sign to become a permanent exhibition in the machine learning chamber. Before leaving, the alchemists advised about the limitation of using machine learning for engineering design. What happens when the accuracy of the model is only 80% or it was 40%? What is the minimum accuracy that are we willing to accept? And a warning quickly followed their questions. Beware of the low-code, no-code experts. Furthermore, remember that the large majority of the validation oracles are not trained to examine the content of the machine learning chamber. So let's go back now to our technical discussion after this part of the story that talks about machine learning. And there are a couple of things that we really want to point it out. Many researchers have shifted their attention towards application of machine learning to rock engineering problems or engineering in general. And indeed, there's an increasing number of research papers that have been published on this topic. However, then we need to acknowledge that the use of advanced machine learning algorithms in combination with all the empirical subjective data collection only creates an illusion of innovation. Why are we insisting, for example, using machine learning tools to assess all classification systems, which we know are subjective in nature? How can machine generate better prediction, to be honest, of RMR, GSI, or Q than those made by engineers? We know that everything is going to be variable. It's going to maybe a GSI plus or minus 10, RMR plus or minus 10, and so on. So how do we know the machine learning can do better? Remembering that there is no accurate RMR and there is no accurate GSI. Machine learning, most importantly, we shouldn't think about machine learning as tools can kind of wash away biases. They're not a magical bias washing machine. If there is subjectivity in the training data, the subjectivity will remain in the output data. However, we believe that we should use these new tools in combination with new approach data collection, and we should focus on truly quantitative parameters. And that's where you're going to really kind of look for the advantages of machine learning. And we should not forget also another important problem. Once images tool that can only few could master, now many engineers and researchers can quickly generate machine learning models without knowing the complex algorithms using the analysis. This is create the perfect condition for a state of chaos, as without access to data and the code, reviewers are left with to assess the validity of the machine learning models solely from patterns, plots, for example, and correlation. In other words, there is the risk that the decision as to whether the results of machine learning models are correct will rest upon personal, therefore subjective preferences. Who is controlling the controller? In this case, who is actually validating the machine learning algorithm? Because we are not expert. We use them because it's now relatively easy to code them in some of those kind of using some of those open library that are available these days. So time now to ask the difficult questions here. So to literally be the elephant in the room. There cannot be true innovation in rock engineering and engineering in general if we choose to ignore these questions. What is the risk of introducing technology without addressing the underlying role the human factors play in rock engineering design? Would our empirical methods have been developed differently at the same level of technology and digitalization we use today been available 50 years ago, when those empirical methods got introduced first? Is the continuous use of old systems developed 40, 50 years ago just a matter of historical development? What about the role of the university actually in this situation when it comes to education of new engineers? How do we teach an empirical discipline like rock engineering or some kind of more inductive engineering discipline, while at the same time ignore the principal engineering knowledge and how it differs from scientific knowledge? And we're going to go back to this difference between scientific knowledge and engineering knowledge in a few slides. Let's conclude our stories now. We start our descent along the spiral staircase. We pass many more chambers erected over the years and follow empirical methods. The record of how the chambers came to be, the original layout, and the content were not easily accessible to the younger alchemists working in the tower. Locks forged in the foundry of time secured the doors, and the validation oracles kept a close watch. We could only glimpse what rested inside through small cracks in the walls. To our eyes, those cracks appeared as if they were slowly growing in the sounds of a distant clock. As we followed the ticking sound of time, our minds could not let go of the challenges of a digital revolution sweeping the alchemist community. The sound morphed into a voice. Read, read, and read even more, but make sure to read also subjects outside of engineering. Because if knowledge could only be coded as a simple sequence of zeros and ones, well, then everything would be easily predictable. We could not think of ways of numerical algorithms to transform biased data into non-biased or qualitative data into quantitative measurements. When it comes to knowledge and learning, we concluded philosophy triumphs over engineering conviction that it's possible to create a machine that can really learn intelligently and in an unbiased manner. We walked once more under the arch of the eyes of the tribe and found a new appreciation for the message it carried. We greeted our guides goodbye and began our return journey. On the way, we discovered an old road sign. Has the road sign been there all the time? And if so, why we did not notice it before? One voice commented, indeed, the road sign pointed in the direction of the alchemist tower, and he read, the rock tower of Babel. So let's conclude now our technical discussion, and we talk about scientific knowledge and gene knowledge. So yes, we live in a tower of Babel. And indeed, if you look at this quote by Kant and Kerr from 2019, we know the science is the same all over the world, or at least in its aims, but it would be difficult to deny that there are natural engineering practices. So that's where we call it Tower of Babel, because depending where you are, the company you're working with, our engineering knowledge actually is not the same. The methods are not the same, the guidelines are not the same. Furthermore, some engineering methods, for example, are constrained by in relation to personal, indeed, national preferences. The adoption, if I can make an example for rock engineering, the adoption by engineers and companies of different versions of RMR and GSI can only be explained on the basis of personal preferences. And there's no scientific validity about the different versions we use in engineering practice. This lack of quantified variables, this uncertainty and spatial variability of geology parameter creates a condition under which it's difficult to forecast time and location of a phenomenon. It would be all too tempting or unwise to mistake machine learning as a solution to our engineering problems. But what it is just a tool in our basically engineering toolbox to help us, but it's not an ultimate solution. It will never be our universal solution because the problems we are analyzing are not universal. So like any other geotechnical tool, machine learning has advantages and limitations, but in the former, it can only be fully exploited by learning the latter. If you don't appreciate the limitation, you will not improve on the advantages. So know the limitation if you really want to improve. We really want to make sure we use these new technologies in our engineering practice. I want to conclude our technical presentation with a riddle. Rock engineering begins with rock and ends with? Well, the answer is not engineering, it's knowledge. And even better, it's objective knowledge. objective quantitative measurements. This is really basically what we should strive for when it comes to using digitalization and new technologies like machine learning and eventually potential digital twins. So hopefully you enjoy the presentation and enjoy the different ways of actually doing the presentation. So thanks for listening. These are my contact details, my email, if you want to have any questions. So thanks again, and see you online for another story.